Hey y'all, it's entry number 53 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Terry McLaurin, wide receiver, Washington Commanders. We'll start with the positives with Terry McLaurin's fantasy profile. Good start to his career. Terry McLaurin has gotten off to a great start in the first 3 seasons of his career, as he's averaged 4.83 receptions on 7.76 targets for 67.2 receiving yards and 0.35 receiving touchdowns over the course of his 46-game career, according to Pro Football Reference. The next thing I really like about Terry McLaurin's fantasy profile is that he got a quarterback upgrade. While Carson Wentz has had his struggles from time to time, he's still likely the best quarterback that Terry McLaurin has ever had. During the 2021 season, Wentz completed 322 passes on 516 passing attempts for 3,563 passing yards and 27 passing touchdowns to just 7 interceptions, according to Pro Football Reference. Considering McLaurin's team has previously totaled 18 passing touchdowns in 2019, 16 passing touchdowns in 2020, and 21 passing touchdowns in 2021, it seems likely that Wentz results in an improvement for the team's passing offense and results in more fantasy production for the team's pass catchers. The last thing I really like about Terry McLaurin's fantasy profile is his air yards. Terry McLaurin averaged 101.2 air yards per game, 1.80 air yards per snap, and had 43% of his team's air yards, according to RotoWire. According to Player Profiler, he had 1,656 air yards, the 4th most among wide receivers, a 41.8% air yard share, the 2nd most among wide receivers, and 914 unrealized air yards, the 3rd most among wide receivers. If he sees similar air yards and can get better quarterback play in 2022, we could see McLaurin put up some nice fantasy stat lines this year. Moving on to some of the concerns with Terry McLaurin's fantasy profile. Disappointing 2021 week-to-week fantasy performances. Terry McLaurin is a very good wide receiver, but his week-to-week fantasy numbers left something to be desired last year. During the 2021 season, in half PPR formats, McLaurin had 3 out of 17 games with 0 to 4.9 fantasy points, 9 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 2 out of 17 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 17 games with over 25 fantasy points, according to fantasy data. Scoring under 10 fantasy points in 12 out of 17 games is not something you want to see out of a guy that generally goes off the board in the first 50 picks. The next concern I have with Terry McLaurin's fantasy profile is Jahan Dotson potentially eating into McLaurin's target workload. The Washington Commanders drafted Dotson in the first round of the 2022 NFL Draft, and he's gotten a ton of praise early on. His head coach, Ron Rivera, has said, "It doesn't matter who's throwing Jahan the ball. The guy has an ability to put himself in a position to make plays." And his quarterback, Carson Wentz, has said that he catches the football as natural as anybody I've been around, according to The Athletic. Based on his talent and the constant positive reports this offseason, it seems like Dotson is being a little undervalued in redraft fantasy leagues right now and could eat into McLaurin's targets a bit more than expected by the general consensus. The last major concern I have with Terry McLaurin's fantasy profile is that Scott Turner's offense is not very wide receiver friendly for fantasy purposes so far. The Washington Commanders have their offensive plays called by offensive coordinator Scott Turner. In the first few seasons of his career as a play caller, he's featured his wide receivers at a below average rate in the passing game relative to other play callers, instead opting towards more usage of running backs and tight ends in the passing game. And that has led to his overall wide receiver room being one of the lowest scoring ones in the league on a per game basis for fantasy leagues. Some additional thoughts on Terry McLaurin. During the 2021 season, Terry McLaurin finished as the WR24 in Standard, with 136.5 total fantasy points and 8.0 fantasy points per game. The WR25 and half PPR formats, with 175.0 total fantasy points and 10.3 fantasy points per game. And the WR25 and full PPR formats, with 213.5 total fantasy points and 12.6 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. Terry McLaurin saw 14 red zone targets in 2019, the most on the team, 18 red zone targets in 2020, the second most on the team, and 11 red zone targets in 2021, the second most on the team according to NFL Savant. Personal opinion: Terry McLaurin is going off the board as WR15, about pick 42 overall, on ESPN, and WR17, about pick 48 overall, on Yahoo. I think he might be a little overvalued right now given his performance last year, which was more of a low-end WR2, high-end flex play, as well as the fact that his quarterback play is still subpar even with the upgrade to Carson Wentz. As of right now, I have him more in the WR17 to WR20 range, depending on the format going into the 2022 season. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization that the player is passionate about. Terry McLaurin's My Cause My Cleats in 2019 was for youth entrepreneurs, which provides students with entrepreneurship education. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.